Well, thank you very much. I am very thankful and humbled you agreed to talk to me today after your talk at the ACA Contemporary last week, which we all thoroughly enjoyed. Um, I must mention that Jonathan Woth has kindly had a look at some of the questions that I would like to ask you today, to ensure they're difficult enough, just as you requested. Also, just a few questions today come directly from Ali and Kevin, who are very grateful for your participation as well. So the first question that I have for you comes from them, actually. Now, you have supported ACA Fine Arts Gallery from the very start. I think that was April 2021. Why were you happy to support such a young gallery?
Well, at that point, they didn't really have a gallery. Basically, I think they were two people that were trying to put on kind of the equivalent of sort of pop-up shows.
Yep.
Ali reminded me that although I wasn't her direct teacher in painting at Canterbury College of Art when I taught there, apparently I used to go around the studios sometimes and talk to the painters. It was a very distinct separation in those days between the painting staff and the sculpture staff. So it was unusual for someone. Anyway, she appreciated that I went into the department and talked about what she was sort of making more like constructions. So we had that kind of connection, but she only reminded me that afterwards. So I think it was just this, people trying to start something up, really. And at that stage, they were asking literally just for a few pieces, a few prints, a few sculptures for various shows they were putting on.
So you're generally very supportive of people trying to start their connections and career in art, like myself.
Yes, I think it's good and also very difficult to make that happen, to make that start, particularly if you're trying to run a gallery, essentially outside of London or a major city. So Cambridge, although it has a sort of kind of artistic culture and obviously educational culture and everything else, it's not easy to find buyers, clients, in a climate mainly outside of London, really. So okay. I thought they were very brave.
Yes, they are indeed. Obviously, they have a very personal touch as well. So I hope they'll succeed in what they're doing. Now, this is your first exhibition in Cambridge, although they know that you have established a connection with Churchill College. Can we look forward to seeing one of your sculptures in the open air in the area this year?
Well, I'm hoping we'll see two of the sculptures.
Okay.
But I can't really say too much about it yet because I'm still working on it with the college, and so it should be. I mean, I was hoping that there would be something there to coincide with the exhibition, but it sort of got delayed a little bit. But hopefully soon, yeah. Sure.
Okay.
I mean, I've got the pieces, I've got the sculptures ready. It's just a case of getting the position and the location agreed, really.
Okay, so there's something brewing then. Very exciting. Thank you. Now, so this one is from me. When looking at your recent circular sculptures set within an architectural space of the Limeworks and at the Thirsk Hall, and I was doing my research and looking at your website in particular, I was under a strong impression that the sculpture display within this broader context intends to enrich the experience of the sculpture by the viewer, creating a kind of a spatial dimension of the artwork's existence. So maybe even acquiring some aspects of site specificity. Can you talk a little bit about the sculpture display as a part of the architectural and landscape context?
Yeah, I don't think that they are cited at the Limeworks in, well, people do recognize the relationship between the sculptures and the architecture of the building. And there's no question that when I moved here, that, you know, subconsciously, I was very influenced by not just the obvious circular nature of the building, but also internally this sense that you can see through from one part to another, the kind of layering of different spaces, the fact that there's a sort of very strong link between the outside and the inside, because there's lots of glass in the building. And so you see this sort of revealing of different areas through, from one end of the house, you can see right across to the other. So in a way, I think the sculptures maybe picked up on that idea of layers, openings, ways through, seeing a kind of internal structure and spaces. And so yeah, I think there was definitely a strong thing. They're not, I wouldn't describe them in any way as site specific sculptures. They're made independent, they're made in their own right. They're made with me looking at them as objects, as sculptures, independent of anything else. They have to work within their own terms. And then it made sense for me, because my studio here, as opposed to my studio in London, is, although most people when they walk in, they think it's in a huge space, actually, by the time you're working on a couple of big sculptures in there, there's not much space. So part of buying this building was having the land to be able to put sculptures outside. And as long as I can get them out of the studio into the landscape, and what I tried to create here, as well as putting sculptures into the landscape, was what I call an outdoor gallery. So I wanted there to be a relationship between the sculptures, more than just seeing them separately in a landscape. I wanted them almost to be like an exhibition in a gallery, so that the levels that they sit on are concrete levels, different heights, steps in between. You know, you walk around a kind of space, almost as if it was a gallery space, but without a roof, without ceiling, and without walls. Although there are tiny, short walls that just give it a kind of, give the spaces a sense of separation from other spaces. And so I like both, really. I like that idea that sculptures relate to each other within a kind of outdoor gallery type space. And then I like that some of the sculptures are seen independently in the landscape. At the moment, right now, outside, one of my guys has a huge JCB, and he's building a big hill, and we're going to put a sculpture on top of the hill. So that will be able to be seen from a long way away. The motorway to Dover passes the house, and you get a glimpse of the house from the motorway. And so from there, we'll be able to see a very big sculpture on top of the hill.
Oh, wow. I'm looking forward to seeing that.
And I would say that having moved here, my relationship with the outside space is obviously much stronger, because in London, it's very much indoor, inside working, my big warehouse, but the inside outside thing didn't really happen much. Whereas here, I try to work outside as much as I can.
So is it fair to say then that in terms of display, there's much more connection with the landscape rather than the architectural context? However, the design is kind of, the design of the sculpture echoes the architectural inspiration.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know that the pieces, when I first started making these pieces, you never really know whether they'll work outside, because the scale, they're not massive sculptures. they're of a kind of human scale. So the height of them is very important, that you can actually see inside the inner parts of the sculpture. And they have a very strong physical relationship in terms of that I make them, I actually make them. They're not made in a factory, you know, where that sort of scale, you know, that human scale changes, you know, it becomes something completely different. They have very definitely a human scale, and it's hard to know whether that will work because they can get dwarfed outside. But I think they work quite well outside. I mean, one of the things about making circular sculptures was that, you know, up until then I'd made much more geometric sculptures which had a definite front and a back, you know, so that you knew that you were looking at this side of the sculpture. The thing with the circle is that you don't have that. You know, the viewer is kind of encouraged to explore the sculpture the whole way around and see it as a kind of complete experience of seeing something. So I think that, and also I think there's a difference between sculpture, just seeing something outside and seeing something, you used the word in the landscape. It's partly, you know, some of them are in the landscape, but there's just a difference anyway between seeing something inside a building and outside, because within a building you have the walls, the ceiling, you know, there's this sort of sense that you're relating an object very much to the walls and the height of the ceiling and things like that. When you put something outside, there's not so much of that for it to relate. So in some senses it stands up in its own right, and in some ways it can actually be affected by everything else around it, by the landscape, but it kind of lets the sculpture breathe a bit more, I think.
Yeah. And there's a significant difference between displaying the large sculpture, although it's a human size, but still kind of larger than your smallest sculpture, in a vast open space and a more enclosed environment, such as the ACA Contemporary Gallery. What concerns, if any, do you have in relation to different display spaces and the ways it might affect the viewer's experience of your work? And why would you, if you would, want a close-up encounter with your work?
I think that I, as well as seeing these sculptures outside, I was actually quite intrigued to see how they would function. I mean, not dissimilar to where I made them in the studio, except perhaps even more limited space, much closer to the object. And I was intrigued by that. So about a year ago, I took two huge sculptures, which I knew were going to an outdoor park setting, and I put them in an indoor setting because I wanted to see how that would work when people couldn't get back so far from the sculpture. And I think with the ACA space, I wanted something similar. I wanted people, particularly in the upstairs room, I wanted that sense that this object dominated the space, and that, you know, when you walk up to see it, it's there. I mean, you can't get away from that. It's like you're completely within the world of that sculpture. And I like both. I mean, I remember people talking about an Anthony Cara sculpture that was shown in the 1960s in Casman Gallery, and apparently you could barely get round the sculpture. I mean, you were right next to it. And I've always remembered that and thought, well, actually, that's a very interesting way to show a sculpture. You know, I mean, the ACA one, there is enough space. In some ways, I guess it would have been interesting if there had, you know, I wouldn't have wanted to put any more sculptures in there. I don't think it would have worked. But I think there are more sculptures in there than you would normally have. But if you go back in time to the 60s and 70s, it was not uncommon for artists to put just 2 or 3 sculptures into one space, but they might be very big, or even one sculpture into a space, you know, so that you're literally focused on that one thing.
Yeah. Well, not only focus, the kind of whole viewership experience, I think, is just completely dominated by almost like this bold statement of just presence of an object.
I mean, the way I make sculptures is literally that, you know, I start with stuff, I start with material, and I make things. I start something. So sheets of material that will have laser cut holes and shapes in them, and the outer edges, and lots of them, without actually making a decision specifically about where they will go, what they're for, or how the sculpture looks. So the sculpture has to evolve through me confronting it and ending up with something. And most of that then is really looking very hard at the object and its relationships, and sometimes having to take things off, putting things in, move, you know, it's a whole experimental sort of process of adding and subtracting, and then eventually arriving at something which I feel, you know, I'm happy with, and that I don't want to change anymore. So I suppose when people see something in a gallery, they're looking at something that's finished. And I've always wondered what it would be like for me to see, you know, just to walk in and see the sculpture, how everybody else sees it, because I've gone through this whole process of making over the last, when I was making the more recent sculptures, I tried on Instagram to show a sort of daily record or a daily change, which actually gives people that sense of how they're made, which I think can be quite interesting, you know, because when people see something finished, it's like, well, you know, well, we don't have any idea how this thing has been made. And it's not dissimilar to the making of the prints. You might be coming on to ask me something about prints. I don't know. Are you? You want me
Yes.
not to say about that? Or
Oh no, you go ahead. Absolutely.
the way the prints are made, I tried to make the prints, the way of making the prints, very close to the way that I make sculpture. And although I'm working with 2 dimensions, I really wanted to feel like each shape that goes onto the print, it's as if I was picking something up and putting it there, and then put another piece there. So I didn't really want. It's very easy with silkscreen to make things look quite decorative, you know, pretty, or you know, kind of more about that. And when you have an overlap of one color to the next, one shape to the next, you get an extra color, you get, you know, and you can play with those things. But that really didn't interest me. What I was interested in was trying to make a kind of equivalent in 2 dimensions of what I had in 3 dimensions. So a similar kind of experience of seeing well, they were almost like objects that had been built up through layers and layers of shape, layers and layers of color, and being able to see through, so that the depth of the surface almost is configured in thin layers. So I wouldn't have really been interested in making prints unless they had this, unless I'd felt that there was this hugely strong connection with the sculpture. And equally, then the prints started to suggest ways that I could make changes in the sculptures. So it started to work both ways. And I've been working on the prints not quite as long as I've been making those sculptures. The circular sculptures, the colored sculptures started about 5 or 6 years ago, and the prints I've been working on for about 4 years. So, but once I started making the prints, it was a very regular visit to Cambridge to the print studio to work on a next series of prints, next series. And each one, in the same way that I made the sculpture, was a sort of, having made the last sculptures, it was then, okay, where now? And it moves on, moves forward. It might not be that recognizable to people, but in myself, I recognize a change or a development, and the same with the prints. So each time I'd go to the print studio, I would set out a different range of possibilities, a different set of images, a different, so each time I was challenging. And also when we worked with the shapes and the screens at the print studio, we never used them again. That was one of my strange, but because each time you make them, they're quite expensive to make, and some of them we didn't even use, but they felt that they were part of something else. So I couldn't use them in the next set because they were my thinking from another time.
As you said during your talk as well, a part of a concluded process, which then allowed you to move to something new.
Yeah, you then start again, and I think that when I used, in fact, in the early stages when I used to make sculpture, when I'd finished a series of sculptures, I had to clear the studio and start with an empty space, and it felt that was important to not rely on things that I'd already made that were there. That gave me a sort of sense almost of security that, oh look, I've made these pieces, so I'm okay. Better to have an empty space and think, almost have a panic about it, because you think, well, where do I go next? I've got to start again. And then what's interesting is just to see things develop, in a space. I mean, I used to work on maybe 8 or 10 sculptures at one time in the space. So that was quite common for me to move between sculptures. Now I tend with the bigger sculptures to be 1 or 2. But I quite like the idea that I focus on one sculpture. Sometimes you need time, so you have to let the thing, sit. Kip always has the expression when a print is finished, he says it's cooked. Which is probably quite a good way to put it. It's like it's up until that point, it's boiling up in it, it's getting the flavors, and anything is possible. You could add something else, but at that point it's cooked. It's done. It's ready to serve. And I think that's probably how it feels.
Yeah, interesting expression. Well, you have directly answered my next question in relation to the monoprints, because I was wondering about this relationship between 2 and 3 dimensionality in your works. So what Ali and Kevin were actually wondering about is how much influence does Kip have over the printmaking process? Do you guide him, or when you're creating the print? Kip mentioned, I think during the talk, that he prepares the screens in advance. So does he have a free range over the shapes, or do you send drawings of what shapes you would like to work with?
No. I send him when he prepares the screens. That it's a process of taking what I've done and putting them onto transparent films, and then that's then put onto the screen. But Kip, and even to the scale, I specify what the scale is of each piece. So no, Kip occasionally, when I put something in and it's a positive shape, he'll include the negative. He's done it a couple of times where he'll say, well, I did that just because I thought it might be interesting for you. So there could be a little bit of like someone saying, like, oh, I did that as an extra bonus because you might use it, you might not use it. And then when we're working on the prints, of course, he's very knowledgeable. So he might say something like, you know that you can actually blank off part of the shape. We just basically put paper on the screen, and then the ink won't go through that. So he'll come up with some things that extend the vocabulary of working. The ingredients get enhanced. But more and more as we've worked, I think, in terms of color, position, because because when I work with Kit, I think he sees sometimes these things in a more painterly way. When I see a print, when I'm working, I see that this thing is actually sitting on something. It's like a piece of sculpture sitting on a plinth or on the ground. When a painter works, it could be this way, it could be the other way. And to me, when it's turned around, or by mistake turned around, let's say, I think, oh God, no, that's the wrong way up. Most people wouldn't notice it, but I'm very conscious of this, that I'm actually making something where almost gravity has a part in it. So I'm seeing it as if it's a standing thing, even though it's in the middle of a piece of paper.
Yeah.
You know.
So you're kind of seeing during the creative process in 3 dimensions what is then transferred onto a flat surface.
Yeah, and then I'll even say to Kit, I'll say, well, I want these colors because they're sculptural colors. You know, they're more sculptural colors than they are painterly colors. And I don't know how I would describe that to you, but there's just some colors that feel more akin to objects and stuff.
Yeah.
And I quite like the idea of reducing the number of colors because it can get quite decorative. So for me, I think as the print, as we've worked more and more, I've tended to limit the pattern we use. So we do use less colors now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. In your talk on Friday, you said that you never thought about making money from art. Does this still influence your choices, and how do you make your art, how you make your art today?
No, it doesn't. I don't think about it at all. I don't, and I never did. No. And when a gallery's, you know, in the early days when, you know, I might have sold, you know, a lot from an exhibition, and the gallery, there is pressure from a gallery to say, oh, we could sell loads of, you know, lots more of those. You can only make what you make whilst it, you know, some artists find a style and then, you know, it's almost as if you're manufacturing something. You know, it's just a commodity in a sense. But for me, it's nothing to do with that. It's about each thing that I make. It's for me. I learn through making that, and by the time it's finished, I'm not precious about that. I'm not like wanting to keep everything that I do. But I wouldn't make anything just because it's easy for a gallery to sell it, or because there might be somebody who wants something more of a certain style of work. And you can only make that whilst it seems relevant, you know. So, you know, I can't tell you. I mean, I might make, well, I mean, the next set of sculptures are probably not circular. You know, although, you know, if you'd asked me a year ago, I'd have said, well, yeah, I'm really enjoying this way of working, but next set of sculptures will be quite different.
Yeah.
So, because I can feel it changing, I can feel something. I can't tell you, I couldn't draw it for you, but there's something kind of abstract sense of a change about to happen, and exhibitions do that. You know, you put on an exhibition that finishes a body, either a body of work, or you see that work in an exhibition, and that sort of triggers a kind of questioning, or an idea that you can move from that. You know, and sometimes it's literally just I've done these and I've learned everything that I want to know. Now I want to explore something else.
Okay. So just one last question, something that was very striking to me, really. Looking back at your body of work, you seem to have arrived at kind of your most organic visual elements. You know, they include sinuous, kind of unexpected contours, dominating circular, soft shapes. they seem to create a tension with some of the industrial medium that you use: aluminum, stainless steel, brass. Would you talk a little bit about maybe these choices in combination and the importance of contrast and juxtaposition in your recent sculpture?
Well, I think I like materials that have a certain resistance, that have to be formed in some way. You know, I like, and also when I work, it might be something as simple as literally curving something or bending something at an angle. But one of the reasons that I like the idea that I pre-cut some of the shapes is that you do then get an element of accident and the unexpected, so that part of my making is very conscious and directed, but some of it, because I've already chosen the shapes and they get used into something, that becomes a kind of, I have to work with those, and they almost do what they do. I wouldn't want to start to curve a sculpture and then start to cut a shape in it. I like the fact that I accept that this element already has that. And then I have to work with that, and then sometimes things get changed. But I've always liked that idea of putting things together that have a kind of identity. So I start with something. I'm not starting just with a material. I'm starting with a material that's had something affecting it, which I then do something with. And with, for example, the way that they're put together, previously I've worked a lot with welding things together to make something have this kind of completeness through literally, you know, fusing something together. When I worked on these pieces, I actually liked the idea that although these elements formed something that was complete, they were made of separate parts, and I kind of emphasized the separateness of them by bolting and by where they overlap, where the connections are, you know, between the sheets, and then emphasizing it perhaps more with the color, so that the initial colors in the very early ones were literally an inside color and a different outside color, just to do that, just to say this is the inside, this is the outside. Although that sounds very, you know, that I made that decision as an idea, it kind of didn't happen like that. It came quite organically that seemed to be appropriate. So nothing, you know, I steer away from what I, you know, I steer away from ideas that appear to be too limiting or too specific. You know, I don't want things to be that clear. I want things to be, well, I sometimes I want them to have a magic. You know, I want them to not be able to be completely.
You work with concepts that are very hard to articulate then, and kind of more intuitive experience of.
I like to be surprised myself by what happens in front of my eyes. I don't want to be in control of it. Well, I do to a certain extent, but I want the thing I'm working on to sort of have its own say. I want it to feed me stuff, so that it's a balance between, you know, what's happening, what the material does, and what I want it to do. So I think the combination of pre-organized materials and then what I do with it, which is still organic and you know, fairly sort of free working, is a good balance for me. You know, I would hate to just, you know, draw or make a small idea and say, here you are, make it big, would have no interest in that at all.
Okay.
So in that respect, I'm not interested in making sculpture. I'm interested in exploring. See, if I say ideas, that's the wrong. I'm interested in exploring visual. How do I even describe it?
It's almost like visual experience.
Well, it kind of, in the end, it's like, well, I'm actually trying to find out about myself. You know, I'm actually doing things that explore where I am. You know, what I'm just. It's just a reflection of me, in a way. Although I don't know what that is, so I'm trying to find it out through making. It sounds pretty garbled, but it's, you know, it's a funny process. The making thing is not. I mean, I think the printmaking goes through the similar sort of stages. You know, you start with something. You have to start with something. So in my case, in the sculpture, I start with materials. I start with, you know, the sheets of materials that have got something, that have already had something done to them. And without those, you know, I'd just be sitting in a chair, sort of scratching my head. So with those, they kind of start a kind of inspiration for doing something with them. It's always very nerve-wracking and slightly tentative at first, because I start to curve what is very expensive materials. So you're starting to work with it. I mean, with a print, you know, it's not expensive. You can rip it in half. You can throw it in the bin. It's not vastly expensive. You haven't necessarily even invested that much time in it, you know. So, but interestingly, with the prints, you seem to get to this point where, you know, we generally make about, I don't know, 40 prints in a 3-day session. They're all monoprints, all unique. And the first day is one phase of the work, and it's really just sort of putting something down. Sometimes it can be literally just putting in the background, putting in a backdrop for something to exist in, like the sort of landscape that something might work with. And then the next day, you know, it takes the next layers and the next, and they're all different. And then gradually they start to get to the point where they need, you know, tweaking in some way, the other bits, and it becomes more, there are more decisions at that point. In the early stage, it's more or less, not anything could happen, but anything's interesting that happens, you know, and then it's sort of tightens up. That the whole process gets quite tight towards the end, where you're literally kind of making smaller decisions, which can actually make a huge difference, but they're sort of, you know, they're not the same.